The year was 1792, and Paris throbbed with fear, anger, and suspicion. The revolution, once a flame of liberty, had twisted into something darker. Whispers of conspiracy traveled like fire in dry hay, feeding the city's paranoia. The monarchy had crumbled, the king imprisoned, yet the revolutionaries felt far from safe. Foreign armies pressed on France's borders, eager to crush the new republic before it could take root. To the people of Paris, every defeat on the battlefield seemed proof of treachery. Suspicion turned inward. If France was losing, it must mean traitors worked from within. Eyes darted at priests, nobles, and prisoners accused of siding with the crown. In the streets, words like counter-revolutionary became as deadly as a blade. By late August, nearly every prison in Paris was swollen beyond capacity. Nobles, priests, Swiss guards, and anyone remotely accused of sympathizing with the monarchy were crammed together. These men and women lived in terror, hearing the chants of angry mobs outside their walls. On September the 2nd, a chill hung in the air, though the city was burning with rage. Word spread that foreign armies had crossed into France, advancing toward Paris. The people feared that prisoners, if freed, would rise from within and slaughter citizens. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors dripped like poison. "They will break free and stab us in our beds," one man whispered. Another shouted, "They plot with the Austrians even now." Fear and fury brewed into one toxic mixture: vengeance. The call to arms came not from officials, but from the streets themselves. Bells rang out from churches, summoning the people. Men and women armed themselves with whatever they could find: pikes, axes, clubs, and rusty swords. The storm was about to break. The Abbaye prison was the first target. Crowds swarmed its gates, shouting for blood. Soldiers tasked with guarding the captives hesitated, their loyalties split between duty and the mob. Soon they gave way, allowing the flood to rush inside. Prisoners trembled as the mob poured into the halls, their torches casting shadows against the stone walls. Nobles in silken rags clutched their hands together. Priests prayed under their breath, and women clutched children to their breasts. None knew who would be spared. Hastily, mock tribunals were set up within the prison. Revolutionaries declared themselves judges, demanding that prisoners defend their loyalty to the Republic. These were not trials. They were death sentences disguised with ceremony. The first noble brought before them barely spoke before the verdict was screamed, "Death!" The crowd erupted, dragging him into the courtyard where blades and clubs tore into him. Blood sprayed across cobblestones as cheers echoed through the air. It became a ritual of horror. Each prisoner was paraded before the mob, asked a few questions, and condemned. Outside, a frenzy of execution unfolded. Bodies piled high, their blood running through the gutters like rainwater after a storm. Inside the prison, screams echoed through the stone corridors. Some prisoners begged for mercy, only to be mocked. Others sang hymns or shouted royalist slogans, meeting death with defiance. Each execution fueled the mob's hunger for more. Women and children did not escape the carnage. Wives of nobles were dragged out by their hair, their pleas drowned by chants of "no mercy." Even young boys, accused of growing into traitors, were cut down. Innocence offered no shield. Priests, too, became victims. Dressed in tattered robes, they were dragged before the mob and accused of conspiring with the Pope. One elderly cleric raised a crucifix as he was struck down, his blood staining the holy symbol he clutched. Outside Abbaye, the stench of death began to fill the air. Blood soaked the ground until it formed sticky pools where the mob stood. Some dipped their hands in it, as though baptizing themselves in vengeance. The massacres did not stop there. Word of the slaughter at Abbaye spread through Paris like wildfire. Crowds turned toward other prisons, the Carmes, the Conciergerie, La Force, each destined to become another altar of blood. At La Force, a carriage of prisoners was brought into the courtyard. Among them were women of noble birth, their gowns shredded and faces pale with terror. The mob surged forward, tearing them apart before they even reached the prison steps. Elsewhere, the Carmes prison became a theater of death. More than 100 priests had been confined there, accused of refusing to swear loyalty to the revolution. They were slaughtered in waves, their bodies dumped in pits outside. Everywhere, the rhythm of the massacre was the same: a makeshift trial, a swift condemnation, and a brutal execution. The mob grew more inventive with each killing. Blades, axes, stones, and bare hands all became instruments of justice. By nightfall on September 2nd, Paris was drenched in blood. Fires burned across the city, torches illuminating scenes of carnage. Families huddled in homes, listening to the roars outside, praying the mob would not come for them next. The government looked on with uneasy silence. Some revolutionary leaders quietly encouraged the slaughter, believing it purged France of enemies. Others were horrified, but dared not speak against the people, fearing the mob would turn on them. As dawn broke on September 3rd, the massacres showed no sign of slowing. The prisons of Paris had become slaughterhouses, and the gutters carried the blood of thousands. The city had crossed a line from which there was no return. For the people of Paris, fear had transformed into a monstrous kind of unity. The massacres were not only vengeance, but also a warning to anyone who dared oppose the revolution. The streets themselves testified to this new, terrible justice. And so the September Massacres began, not with a decree but with a cry from the crowd. Paris had turned into a city of executioners, and the days ahead promised only more blood. September 3rd dawned grey, but Paris was already awake. The bells that had once called people to prayer now summoned them to vengeance. Crowds swelled once again, their chants echoing through narrow streets as they marched toward the prisons. The Abbaye had already been soaked in blood, but it was far from over. Bodies still lay in the courtyard, stiffening in the morning air. The mob stepped over corpses as if they were stones, intent on continuing their work of justice. At La Force prison, the mob surged through the gates. Inside were nobles, common criminals, and even children. The line between guilt and innocence vanished as the crowd declared itself the voice of the revolution, with no authority above it. One prisoner, a young boy no older than 10, clutched his mother's skirts as they were dragged before the makeshift tribunal. She pleaded that he was just a child, incapable of treachery. The judge's answer was cold. He will grow into an enemy. Both were cut down. The crowd cheered as if they had destroyed a great threat, though it was only flesh and bone. The boys' cries echoed through the courtyard before they were silenced forever. The massacre was no longer just vengeance. It was bloodlust. The Carmes prison, filled with clergy, soon faced its reckoning. Rows of priests were hauled into the courtyard where crowds jeered. Their white collars, once symbols of piety, now marked them as enemies of liberty. Many priests refused to renounce their faith or swear loyalty to the new republic. Their defiance sealed their fate. They were butchered one by one, their hymns turning into death songs, silenced by blades and clubs. Witnesses later recalled the piles of bodies in the Carmes courtyard, limbs twisted, and faces frozen in terror or prayer. Blood seeped into the earth until the ground itself seemed to reject it, unable to absorb so much at once. Not all executions were swift. Some prisoners were toyed with, forced to kneel while the mob mocked their titles and wealth. Nobles were dressed in rags and paraded before jeering crowds before being cut down. The cruelty was deliberate. At the conciergerie, the mob's fury reached new heights. This prison, famous for housing important captives, became a stage for mass killing. Prisoners were lined up, interrogated briefly, and dragged to their deaths in the courtyard. Some women of noble birth were spared the tribunal altogether. Instead, they were beaten and assaulted in the streets before being hacked to pieces. Their blood spattered against the prison walls like grotesque murals of revolution. The violence spread like wildfire. Crowds moved from one prison to the next, fueled by wine, rage, and the certainty that they were purging France of traitors. The line between justice and savagery no longer existed. It was only blood. By September 4th, the massacres had taken on a rhythm. Prisoners were brought before the mob, condemned in seconds, and executed immediately. The killings became so constant that some joked it was faster than the guillotine. The city stank of death. Streets outside prisons ran with blood, mingling with the filth of the gutters. Dogs prowled at night, gnawing on discarded limbs, while crows circled overhead, feasting on flesh left in the open. Families of the condemned wept outside barred gates, begging for mercy. Some offered bribes, hoping to save a son or father, but few succeeded. More often, gold was taken, and the victim still dragged to the blade. The revolutionary press painted the massacres as an act of necessity. Pamphlets circulated declaring the people had acted to protect the Republic. To many, this was not murder. It was the will of France itself. Yet not all were convinced. Some Parisians watched in silence, terrified. They dared not speak against the mob, for silence was safer than sympathy for the dead. Even so, horror etched itself onto their faces as they passed blood-soaked streets. The killing spread beyond Paris as word reached the provinces. Other cities took inspiration, carrying out smaller massacres in their prisons. The revolution's violence was no longer confined to Paris. It was a contagion infecting all of France. Back in the capital, leaders of the revolution remained divided. Figures like Danton hinted that the massacres were necessary, while others recoiled in private. None dared confront the mob directly, for fear of being branded enemies themselves. On September 5th, the La Force prison became a graveyard of memory. Within its walls had been held the Princesse de Lamballe, a close friend of Queen Marie Antoinette. Her fate became one of the most infamous of the massacres. Dragged before the mob, she was questioned about her loyalty to the Queen. Her refusal to denounce Marie Antoinette sealed her doom. She was hacked apart in a frenzy so savage that even hardened killers looked away. Her head, severed and placed on a pike, was paraded through the streets of Paris. Crowds roared as it was carried to the Temple prison where the captive royal family was held. The sight struck terror even into the heart of the Queen. By now, Paris was drowning in blood. Over 1,000 prisoners had been executed in just a few days. Corpses clogged the courtyards, stacked in heaps like cordwood, as the stench became unbearable. Mass graves were dug, but they filled quickly. Bodies were tossed in without ceremony, stripped of clothing and dignity. Lime was scattered over the pits, but the earth still bulged with the horror buried beneath. On September 6th, the massacres slowed, not from mercy but from exhaustion. The mob, drunk on violence and wine, began to disperse. The prisons, once teeming with life, now echoed with silence and the smell of decay. Paris had transformed into something unrecognizable. The revolution had claimed not just lives, but the soul of the city. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been drowned in rivers of blood. The September massacres had carved themselves into the very stones of Paris. And though the killing eased, the memory of those days would haunt France forever. When the mob finally dispersed, Paris fell into a strange silence. The city was no longer alive with chants and cries, but heavy with the stench of blood. The gutters, once rushing with crimson, now dried into dark stains on the cobblestones. Inside the prisons, the air reeked of decay. Doors hung open where mobs had forced their way in. Cells that once held prisoners were now filled only with corpses, piled high, their faces locked in final expressions of terror. Families crept back into the streets, searching for loved ones. Mothers wept at prison gates, recognizing scraps of clothing or jewelry among heaps of dead. Fathers dug through mass graves, hoping for a glimpse of a son or daughter. The revolutionary leaders spoke cautiously. Some praised the massacres as a patriotic necessity, claiming France had been cleansed of traitors. Others whispered in disgust, but dared not openly condemn the people. Fear ruled even those who governed. International eyes turned toward France in horror. Newspapers in London and Vienna printed lurid accounts of the bloodshed. To monarchies across Europe, the revolution revealed its true face, a mobocracy drunk on violence, impossible to reason with. Inside France, the massacres left deep scars. Survivors who had escaped death carried trauma in their eyes. They spoke in hushed voices of priests butchered at altars, women torn apart in the streets, and nobles hacked down like animals. The revolution had been born with ideals of justice, yet now justice was drowned in blood. The line between citizen and executioner blurred. Ordinary men and women who once cheered for liberty had become butchers in the name of the Republic. But the killings also served as a warning. Those who might have opposed the revolution now held their tongues. No noble, priest, or commoner dared openly resist, for they had seen what became of those labeled enemies. The Princesse de Lamballe's fate in particular sent shivers through France. Her severed head carried on a pike to the Queen was not just murder but humiliation. It told all who watched that even the closest to royalty could be defiled without restraint. The royal family, locked in the temple prison, heard the mob outside with dread. Marie Antoinette, upon seeing her friend's head, nearly collapsed in shock. For her and King Louis, the massacres were a grim prophecy of their own fate. As September waned, the city began to bury its dead. Carts creaked under the weight of bodies, hauling them to pits at the edges of Paris. Lime was poured to mask the smell, but nothing could mask the truth of what had happened. The revolution marched forward, but the September massacres remained its shadow. They showed that the people, once oppressed, could wield terror as brutally as any tyrant. The revolution had turned inward, devouring its own in a frenzy of fear. And yet for many Parisians, the bloodshed brought a strange sense of grim satisfaction. They believed they had struck first against treachery, that they had saved the Republic from conspirators. The murders became, in their eyes, a terrible act of survival. But history would not remember it as survival. It would remember it as slaughter. The September massacres became a stain upon the revolution, proof that noble ideals could twist into nightmares when consumed by fear and fury. In the end, Paris remained haunted. Streets once filled with chants of liberty now whispered of ghosts. The city had feasted on its own prisoners, and though the blood dried, the memory of those days would never fade.